on nothing. I'm going to be philosophizing on nothing, though paradoxically, the meaninglessness, arbitrariness, and absurdity associated with nothing. But on the contrast to that, the opposite, which is not so much quite always the contrast, because sometimes the contrast is very much what complements the exact same concept of discussion. The very words that we use to describe one thing can also pertain in a highly similar regard for what is seemingly the opposite, and which tends to connect things in a spectrum in which there are all these different infinite meanings that have very specific, ironic meanings to them. Meanings that actually don't apply to other categories, interestingly enough, and categoricals of meaningful information. When we're thinking about nothing, for example, it's not the same thing as thinking about some aspect of existence or some element of existence. Though nothing is connected to some meaning rather than no meaning, though at the same time, nothing, if we're trying to truly constitute a meaningful definition of nothing, we have to do something that really requires us to do something that we can only do with our imaginations. And that's to imagine, which is ultimately an impossibility for consciousness to be, and more particularly, which outside of just consciousness is also more pertains to meaningful information that has to operate within consciousness to be able to actually comprehend the information and think. Because thinking is, as a must, good enough and necessarily necessary to be able to engage in that meaning process. And there wouldn't be a meaning process within consciousness had we not have direct perceptions to be able to constitute meaning. And when we're thinking about nothing is something that we imagine. We imagine a sort of absence of existence, a lack of existence, and we can only really constitute the sense and feeling of meaninglessness within existence and arbitrariness and even the absurd. And the absurd is often what disrupts the meaning that exists already, or that we are more inclined to uptake and are more willful in responsibilities that we will voluntarily endure suffering of our own accord in exchange for certain meaningful emotions that outweigh those cons and risks associated with the rewards and benefits of that meaningful endeavor. And embarking on a journey towards the meaningful requires taking on more responsibility that we may not be so eager to take up at first, and which requires these stepping stones of meaning to be able to build up that incremental courage. Yet, there's a important lesson to be found within that journey of self-discovery, that impulsivity is actually a self-virtue in some sense, that can be a guiding light towards the meaningful by really pushing at the boundaries of our own existence and taking up agency to be able to create meanings within this space of nothingness, in which also the meaninglessness can provide us the fodder that fuels our fire and which brings out our passions in creative ways. And going back to that infinite spectrum between nothing and some meaning, there are ways of actually going about this that are wrong. We can be wrong about what we think about nothing. For example, that we could say experience nothing, or that had we only been a conscious process, we would be able to still experience something of meaning, but that's not quite true. We wouldn't necessarily have a meaningful experience. We could just be aware if we were just a consciousness, and we do really require direct perceptions to be able to engage creatively in any sort of creating of meaning. And without thinking, we wouldn't be able to actually meaningfully do anything at all. And the spectrum between nothing and meaningfulness and meaninglessness, they're different. They're different axes. If you were to think about where we put meaninglessness and meaningfulness, they're part of a different continuum than where we put some meaning and no meaning, the nothing of meaning. Those are very different ways of approaching meaning. And that really is what consciousness and direct perception help us to distinguish, as we can isolate the meaningful within uniquely direct perception, and the potential for meaninglessness to be recognized and realized only within also direct perception, where consciousness itself, when we don't have access to realization processes of meaningful information, we can't actually factually, rather than just merely perceived, recognize and realize even when we're engaging in something that's truly meaningless. We're more automatons, more, not so much automatons, but almost robotic in nature, where we're just kind of passive to the surrounds and just letting things happen to us and not able to operate the self. And that's really important and meaningful for being able to engage anything meaningful, and that deepens the meaningfulnesses. And that's all I want to say for this video. I hope you have an awesome one. Bye.